Welcome to Learning Thursdays. I'm Dean Hale with the OASAS Learning and Development Unit and your host for today's presentation. Today's presentation is part 2 of Deaf Culture and Deaf and Hard of Hearing Individuals with Substance Use Disorder. And again, joining me today are Susan Demers and Kevin Poor of the Substance and Addiction Intervention Services for the Deaf.
Hello again. We are back and ready for part 2. Here we go.
Yeah, we're excited to get into it. Hopefully you've had a chance to review and reflect on what you learned in part 1 of our presentation. I wish we could be there to answer your questions live, but fear not, you can reach out to Susan and myself if you have any questions. Anytime.
I know we threw a lot of information at you in part 1, and today will be chock full of more information about deaf culture. And this does not make you an expert in deaf culture, having finished these 2 trainings. Of course, this is just meant to pull back the curtain on the rich culture and history that we have in the deaf community.
Part 2 is going to shift focus a little bit. We'll be talking about how to best interact with deaf people in your facilities and sharing some of the best practice advice that we have on how to work with them. First, we have to talk about the landscape of a deaf person seeking treatment. Identifying the barriers to treatment that this community experiences is the first step to ensuring they receive adequate care. In part 1, we identified that deaf people are a marginalized group. They experience a lot of barriers to their everyday life. They're systemically seen as less than, and their needs are often not considered when treatment programs are being developed. That means the system that they are trying to access care in is not necessarily designed for their needs. And that can be very difficult for a deaf person who just needs help.
And it's worth mentioning that people tend to forget to include deaf folks in the decision-making process. If you're making seemingly small decisions and then expecting the deaf person to just go along with it, that makes them feel like an afterthought. Why not include the deaf person in the initial day 1 of the decision-making process? Because it's harder to backpedal and fix the errors if you've already made those changes. It's easier to include the deaf person in the project or program right from the get-go.
Often this starts with policy. Even if there's a policy that requires that you call an interpreter, calling one is an afterthought.
Budgetary line items can be created as well to afford this service.
Right. Those facilities that have more deaf patients know what to do, but it means their costs go up. They spend more money on interpreters and other accommodations as compared to facilities that don't have a large deaf population.
The deaf community can be considered a linguistic minority. We had mentioned before that 90% of deaf people are born to hearing families and the challenges and struggles that come along with communicating in that sort of family dynamic. We have something that is called dinner table syndrome. We refer to that in the deaf community in instances where hearing families are eating dinner and the deaf person is left out of those conversations. They could be talking about anything and everything without including the deaf person. The deaf person is missing that information and no one is relaying it to them in a form that is understandable. Or when the deaf person asks, so what are we talking about? Family members typically will say, oh, it's not important, or I'll tell you later. And typically they don't tell you later, which leads to gaps in knowledge and language deprivation for the child.
You're right. Deaf children miss out on a lot of information. Family connections are built at the dinner table. Deaf children are sometimes the last to know when a family member passes away. Maybe they were close with their great aunt, but they don't always find out in time to attend that person's funeral. Growing up in a hearing household myself, I learned to eat fast so I could leave the table and do my own thing because I wasn't being included in that conversation. And back in my day, we didn't have smartphones to keep us entertained. So I just ate, cleared my plate, and got up and left.
Oftentimes as well, deaf people don't know their family history, especially relating to their family health history or medical history, or examples of substance use disorders within their own family. They're not aware of these instances, and so you may come across a deaf patient who doesn't know the answers to some of your initial medical forms. And you may be sitting there thinking, well, why would you not know this? Why would you not know your own medical information, your family history? It does not mean that they are not smart. It means that they experienced language deprivation. They experienced moments of not being able to learn through incidental learning because their family did not communicate in sign language to them.
It happens all the time. Deaf patients say they don't know their history. It might be a hearing family member who's at the hospital with them who fills in the gaps. They might be finding pertinent medical information about themselves in the moment because they have an interpreter.
Yeah, that's not a rare occurrence. That does happen sometimes.
There is a lack of public awareness. There's a knowledge gap when it comes to deaf people's needs, the challenges they face, and the gaps of knowledge they experience from that missing incidental learning. It's often overlooked that this is a specialized population that needs specialized services. People think they can just get tossed in with the hearing patient group, and it just doesn't work that way.
It may be the case that deaf people looking for treatment and addiction services may not be interested in receiving services through a group that caters to hearing people. They feel misunderstood there, and they know that the staff is unaware of deaf culture, and maybe they're not deaf friendly. So this can lead to mistrust of the staff because the deaf person has to explain their needs, their communication preferences, and educate and teach while they're there to receive medical attention and medical services. And this is just something that they do not want to be burdened with.
I'm often asked, when I'm asked where are the numbers, we like to say, if you build it, they will come. But at the same time, deaf people have had their hopes dashed when it comes to specialized services. They're not buying the same old story, and they don't always seek out services. And then, without the metric to prove the need, how do you ask for more funding without the deaf patient population? It's difficult to argue for a more accessible service. It's cyclical. It's the chicken and the egg. When it comes to preventative efforts, maybe you remember from your own education the DARE program, right? Law enforcement drug education program. Slogans like, just say no. These preventative programs are not made for deaf people. They're not in sign language. Deaf kids of hearing parents don't know how to express themselves very well. It becomes a compounding issue that makes treatment later in life that much more difficult. Without proper preventative programs, they might experiment with drugs without understanding the potential consequences.
That is true. And I believe we can go to our next slide now.
Well, I think to the last bullet here, deaf people seeking treatment go in alone. It's exceedingly rare to have even 2 deaf patients in any treatment program. They might have an interpreter for only a small portion of their day. That interpreter might be competent. They might not be. It's an isolating experience. How can these people feel included or cared for if they're totally alone. It means they're more likely to leave treatment early, and it's the same old isolated experience. Too often, they don't finish their treatment because of it.
Often, being in these spaces where hearing people are, again, the majority, deaf people get bored waiting for communication to come to them.
Right. How do you build a rapport system, right? Usually through camaraderie, and they don't have an access to that. We mentioned confidentiality and privacy in part 1. That's always a concern. What if someone sees me? What if they find out? People are scared and they don't ask for help. There's no anonymity for deaf people in a self-help meeting. The 2 or 3 deaf people in that AA or NA meeting already know each other, or maybe they use drugs together. Do we ask each deaf person to attend a different meeting so they're the only deaf person there? That lack of privacy is a huge barrier for treatment.
Lack of privacy, knowing each other versus being the only person in an all-hearing group, it's a hard decision to make. It's a hard choice to be left with as a deaf person.
Right. You're stuck into the lesser of 2 evils.
Not an easy choice to make by any means. The deaf community is very small, as we've mentioned before. It's about 1 degree of separation, so there's almost no secrecy.
There's also a knowledge gap in the deaf community about drugs and alcohol, other issues related to recovery. These folks don't necessarily have the most supportive system. To be sober and stay clean, you need a support system. You have to lean on family members or have an AA sponsor or a trusted friend group, right? You need that support when you're going through a hard time. But if you say to an uneducated deaf community member, I'm jonesing for a beer, they'll tell you, don't think that way. They don't know how to be supportive because they don't understand the addiction recovery process. They don't understand the services that are available, if there are. The thing is, there's shockingly few resources available. Maybe there is a recovery program that caters to deaf people, but it's out of state. And as soon as you come back home, you're finally back with your signing community, but they're all still using drugs. So it's immensely difficult.
Depending on your friend group and your location, it can be very challenging.
Well, and funding is a big issue as well. I may have mentioned earlier there's only a handful of treatment facilities in the nation that cater to deaf and hard of hearing people. There, in fact, are 4. There's 1 here in Rochester. 3 of them are in other states. You know that insurance doesn't cover treatment across state lines, and Medicare now requires a 20% payment upfront. So this means that someone who lives in Pennsylvania near the New York state border can't get specialized treatment here in Rochester because they're not from New York. That's an insurmountable barrier. It could be changed pretty easily, but the takeaway is that the options are incredibly limited.
We need communication access in treatment facilities, and when we're punished by placing additional barriers in front of us, it leads to barriers to treatment.
It is awful. I've been in the field since 1989, and I'll be honest, I don't have many recovery stories to tell. Sure, there's more awareness now, but there are still only 4 treatment centers in the States, and only 2 of those truly specialize in care for the deaf and hard of hearing folks. The other 2 are mixed populations.
Could we explain why there's only 4 and what that looks like for a deaf group or a hard of hearing group?
Sure, yeah, thank you. I mean to say, these are facilities where the staff and management are familiar with the deaf community, their issues, the challenges they face, and crucially, they all use sign language. They can communicate directly with the patients without the need of an interpreter, so there's no third party. This means in a group setting, you can have a vulnerable and personal experience without having to repeat yourself for the interpreter or worry that you've been misunderstood. It's direct access without interruption. It's that interruption in the treatment that makes folks feel less included. Suddenly, they're not the only deaf person in that group setting. They're not being dismissed or ignored because staff or their peers don't know how to interact with them. Right? They're not locked into the observer role during group discussion. They can actually participate. The materials themselves, the videos, the information that is shared is designed for deaf people. The language is different, but also the approach is tailored to their needs. I find that there is a greater chance of a successful recovery. Of course, not for everyone, but having the right treatment facility goes a long way. Of course, each person has their own challenges, but they're not cast aside right at the start because the facility isn't ready to manage their care appropriately because of the language barriers. So it takes away that additional burden, and that deaf person can just focus on receiving care.
Again, only 4 treatment facilities that work well with deaf and hard of hearing folks out of all 50 states. Surely not enough.
That's right. Self-help, again, it's tough. Many deaf folks do attend self-help groups. However, they're alone, or they are one of, or 2 or 3 deaf people there. These big book meetings, NAAA, are based in the personal narrative. People get up, they share their story. Or it's discussion-based, and deaf people just don't get as involved. If they're working with an interpreter, that person may or may not be trained in the field. Maybe they're not accustomed to the deaf person's language, or they're struggling to keep up the pace. Not to mention, meeting availability is severely limited. If you bring up the list of AA meetings here in Rochester, there are 385 meetings every week. Of those 385, only 5 of those meetings are run in ASL. They're a deaf-only space. Only 4 of those meetings have an interpreter there. So of those 385 meetings per week, a deaf person is locked into 9 options. It's a huge barrier.
Having the interpreter there is a point of access, but does it mean full communication access is happening? Not always. The interpreter's processing time could cause the utterances to be delayed, and when the deaf person has a moment to raise their hand to add into the conversation, it feels as if it's almost too late to jump in, and the group feels that they're bringing up old information. But in their real-time conversation through the interpreter, that's the point that they wanted to make a comment on. And so it really comes down to having an interpreter who is very skilled at environment management to keep up with the pace of the meeting, as well as to be ready to voice for any moment that the deaf person would like to add into the conversation. So they're allowed to jump in just as their hearing counterparts.
These treatment facilities exist in an audio-centric milieu. The announcements come over a sound system. The announcements for mealtime or snack time, what have you, it all happens on a PA system that a deaf person misses. They might depend on someone else to say, hey, let's go, it's time for group. Visiting hour announcements, mealtime, etc. All of this happens over the PA. Maybe there's a hearing person talking with someone outside of the room. The deaf person doesn't know what's going on in that environment.
That can come up other times when you're sitting in the same room with a deaf person and someone calls you from the hallway potentially, and you start to speak back because that's hearing culture, leaving the deaf person out of this conversation or confused about where you're directing your communication at. It is considered polite to excuse yourself and explain what just happened.
Well, not to mention Bluetooth. Now everyone's got a phone in their ear and they're all walking around talking to themselves.
That catches me all the time.
Enabling is another form of deaf oppression, a barrier to treatment. The pitiful deaf person perspective. Parents and family don't want this person to get in more trouble. The problem that they already have is that they're deaf. An overnight jail stay for a DUI means they might get bailed out in the morning, when someone else would be made to experience the consequences of that behavior. This enabling happens in other ways too. School behavioral issues are swept under the rug to avoid a statistical increase in disruptive behavior. Let's say they go to court for a DUI, for example. The penalty is usually mandated treatment or a DUI course. But if the judge doesn't understand the deaf experience or accessibility, they may just waive that consequence. They're deaf and they get let go with a warning, which doesn't actually help change their behavior, right? Because there's an issue for lack of interpreter. They just have that punishment waived and they're let go with a slap on the wrist, which is insufficient if what we're trying to do is behavioral correction.
In treatment facilities, it's important that the staff have access to resources. We here can be a resource, and we will talk about how to procure qualified interpreters, as well as how to alleviate some of the communication burden on the deaf patients that you may be interacting with, instead of leaving it up to them to advocate for their own access and accommodations.
Right. Or this person has to go back to court for a non-compliance, right? Round and around we go.
Again, the system fails us.
The system rolls on as it was designed. They don't know what to do with people who don't fit the mold. There's no other option. Language issues, the third bullet here. Accessibility, of course. Deaf people miss out lots on everyday information that other folks overhear. Words like hangover or bender, terms that are common among drinkers, all this jargon, Other phrases that are common in this community. Alcoholic culture, the culture of an AA meeting, the common phrases that you overhear, keep it simple, stupid, keep it simple, sweetie. The phrase keep coming back, or we do this one day at a time. These are just words. They communicate a rich concept based on shared knowledge and experience that deaf people don't have. So they're already behind, sometimes entering treatment because they're learning all of this language on top of trying to seek care.
We've also come to notice that deaf people tend to stay longer or need more support because of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. If you're familiar with that triangle, if the basic fundamental needs are not met, those missing elements need to be repaired. We need to reset the foundation and then build upon the next layer. And so some of these gaps can lead to detrimental behaviors and lead to them staying longer in treatment facilities.
Right. Another reason they stay longer in treatment is the issues with the next phase in their treatment. Just because a deaf person is ready to graduate to a halfway house doesn't mean that there's a halfway house that accepts deaf patients. They may not be equipped with light flashing systems, there's no visual fire alarm or light flashing doorbell. Knocking doesn't work for them, so there's a delay even if they agree to set those things up. It takes time. It might be 2 or 3 months post-discharge, where they're just waiting in a lock-in treatment facility. And the system is just not proactive. The deaf person's made to wait, sometimes months, through no fault of their own. The last bullet here, lack of recognition. I previously mentioned the lack of community knowledge around alcohol issues. There's not always an acknowledgement that frequent drinking is a mental health problem. Without a deep understanding of substance use disorder in the community, how do you work to solve a problem that you don't know about, right? How do you recognize a problem if you don't know how to do that? The social stigma is a big deal. Deaf people are embarrassed and ashamed.
It's my belief that the landscape for talking about substance use disorders is improving as compared to the past.
Yeah, it's a shame. But I will say that programs like ours, SAISD, we've worked really hard on public awareness campaigns. We make posters, and through videos, messaging, workshops, we try to teach clinicians how to be more supportive of those folks who are dealing with substance use disorders and educate the community as well. So that certainly makes a difference locally. We can only hope other states are doing their part.
Right, and we can move on to the next slide. So as we just mentioned, deaf patients are typically alone in hearing programs and oftentimes ignored or left out enough to the point that they feel bored enough to leave. The environment is not supportive for them, so they have no motivation to stay. So they leave these programs. It's vital that your facilities are supportive and providing communication access to all of your patients at all times. These are just some tips for creating budgetary line items for interpreters at the facilities. Having interpreters there, of course, cannot be a 24/7 position, but having an interpreter there for some of the meetings and some of the day will go towards improving the environment tenfold. You can also request a video phone to be set up in your facility. This is a channel that deaf people use to make phone calls. It's set up with a TV screen and a phone system. The deaf person will make phone calls, and we'll show you some images of what this device looks like on the next couple of slides. These are devices that you can request to be set up in your treatment center or facility. This would allow deaf folks to make phone calls. Of course, if your facility does not allow any of your patients to make phone calls outside of the facility, then you would not be eligible to set up a video phone in your center. But if your regulations do allow for this, this is something you can request. There's always the option to type back and forth to have conversations with your patients or folks getting treatment. You can also incorporate the use of charts and or pictures to communicate with people who may be from a different country and do not read or write English. Depending on their literacy skills, you may be able to write back and forth. Otherwise, you may have to use pictures of faces making different emotions to allow the deaf person to express their emotions through a sort of communication chart. Of course, there are other ways to communicate without fully relying on sign language or English. You can always encourage socialization amongst peers in these groups. If there are 2 deaf people in your facility or in your treatment center, they may not be interested in being friends necessarily, but encouraging socialization and encouraging the formation of a support system could definitely benefit both of these patients. If a group meeting is happening and the interpreter is not available, or they miss the meeting for some reason, then it's only fair to cancel the entire meeting. It would be unfair if you continue on with the meeting with the rest of the hearing group and dismiss the deaf person back to their room. That would be rude, and again, unfair. If the interpreter is not there, that means communication cannot happen between everyone in group, and therefore the meeting should be postponed.
Right. From the perspective of a billing department, a cancellation is not ideal. Bear in mind for scheduling, what happens to the deaf person if the interpreter cancels? Cancellations happen all the time. If the interpreter can't come for the 10 o'clock group, then just move that session to 1 o'clock when the interpreter can be there, right? Let's do the work to accommodate this deaf person. They've suffered enough.
That's exactly how inclusivity works. Inclusive environments are environments that include everyone. Hosting meetings with an interpreter present and canceling them if there's no interpreter present. Again, making sure that all of your TVs or movies that are being played have captioning turned on. Announcements can be made through digital readout screens and other devices.
Right, that text scroll.
These could be as simple as announcements about dinner or lunch or visiting hours. There's also the potential to use visual communication through a whiteboard. Writing down simple communication on this whiteboard is a visual form to make sure everyone in the space is included. Let's see, I think it's important to mention interpreting costs and budgeting for those ahead of time, creating budget line items so that you're not stuck following a budget that does not allow for these services to be provided. You can move around money to make sure that interpreting services are included in your budget from the start.
I know there's a lot to think about, but let's move on to the next slide.
It can be hard to make these small changes, but they end up making a big difference.
That's how change happens, right? It starts with one person and grows from there.
Now let's talk about interpreters.
Well, what you're listening to right now is not my voice. The male voice you hear is that of an interpreter. The female voice is the interpreter for Susan. That's commonplace in our world. That's just how it's done. I also work as a deaf interpreter, so I grew up with interpreters. From my academic life as a child to my professional life as an adult. You have to understand it's not enough to grab someone off the street who knows a little bit of sign language. Interpreters are trained in interpreting training programs. They often learn ASL as a second language, but at the same time, they're taking interpreting courses. By the time they graduate, they have only had 4 years of exposure to a new language, and they don't all achieve fluency in that time, and they don't have much work experience. So they need more time in the field to gain that competency and that fluency.
And that's why deaf and hearing people have preferred interpreters. Some interpreters are not qualified to be interpreting in that specific area. They may not know about substance use disorders or terms relating to addiction. You have to find an interpreter who is qualified for that area of expertise. If a deaf person says that this interpreter is not a good fit for me or for this space, please listen to them. Putting just any interpreter into any space is not going to work. These environments are highly specialized. And if you think about it, you wouldn't want your surgeon to become your OBGYN the next day. Additionally, you wouldn't want your OBGYN, who's very skilled, to go do brain surgery on your child the next day. We have to stick to our specialization, just as interpreters are specialized and specially trained in certain areas. It's not a one-size-fits-all.
Technically, there is a qualification of competency, the National Interpreter Certification, which is issued through the Registry of Interpreters for the Deaf, RID. Interpreters take both a knowledge written exam and have a skills-based performance exam. Then they can show on paper they know what they're doing. But not all who become certified are qualified to do this specialized work. The issue is that an interpreting agency can only tell you if there's an interpreter available, not necessarily if they're qualified or a good fit in that setting. If no one has complained about their quality of service, the agency assumes no news is good news. We need to figure out some mechanism to screen interpreters so that when facilities contract with an interpreter, a savvy third person familiar with that work can vet them on your behalf to make sure they're the appropriate choice for that setting.
Right, I'll let you explain this part.
Professional boundaries can be an issue as well. Interpreters must be able to interpret well, but also interact with deaf and hearing patients with appropriate boundaries.
The interpreter also would be responsible for knowing the specific jargon for working in that area, jargon specific to treatment facilities. They're also following a code of professional conduct while they're interpreting, or they should be. If, for example, the interpreter outside of a courtroom decides to disclose to their client that they have also experienced domestic violence, that is against the code of professional conduct. It's just not appropriate to do that. As an interpreter, you need to have good boundaries and stay to them.
Anytime an interpreter is working, not only are they communicating what's being said, but they're also conveying environmental noise, like a phone ringing in the adjacent room, or something that falls to the floor that makes the counselor jump in their seat.
They could also add in other environmental sounds like a baby crying or announcements that are coming over the loudspeakers or gossip that's happening in the room next door. If the interpreter can hear it, they should interpret what they're hearing to the deaf client.
Right. So if you say, don't interpret this part, just know they're going to interpret everything. If you need privacy from the deaf person, you should be having that conversation in a different room. An interpreter will often explain that they must interpret whatever they hear.
Of course, yourself as the service provider, providing direct service to the deaf person, you should speak directly to the deaf person as you would with any other client instead of speaking to the interpreter. Also, don't ask the interpreter to ask the client anything. Just speak as you normally would, and the interpreter will follow accordingly, signing everything you say and speaking everything they sign.
As I said before, there's a wide range of both skills and ethics. Interpreters also have their own preferences. Some may not want to work in particular settings, like drug and alcohol treatment, for example. That just may not be their area of expertise. It can make finding a competent interpreter for this work pretty difficult.
Or if the interpreter themselves has struggled with addiction and recovery, they may be triggered by that environment, so it may not be a good fit for them to be the interpreter in that setting.
Right. We've mentioned it can be hard to find an interpreter. An agency might send a specific interpreter because they charge less per hour, right? It means greater profit for the agency. There may be a qualified interpreter who doesn't want to take that assignment because of some negative experience at that site, or they don't feel appreciated. Maybe they don't work in that specific setting by choice. For whatever reason, they may not want to interpret in that field. So sometimes what you get are the leftovers, the folks who are not qualified for this work. The facilities themselves, the treatment center or what have you, is looking for the most cost-effective option, right? It's cheaper for them, but it harms the deaf person.
It can be damaging to both parties.
Right. Then the deaf person's treatment outcomes are worse. There's a greater chance of relapse. Faulty communication has lasting consequences. So cheap interpreters exist, but they may not be qualified or certified, or they've got a ton of baggage themselves. So we say when it comes to interpreters, you get what you pay for.
Exactly. If you are looking for the cheapest bid for interpreters, you may not find the highest quality in those interpreters. The cost of missed information, misunderstandings, and limited access is always higher than the cost of the actual interpreter. And there could be chances for a lawsuit to come into play. Liability and malpractice could be threatened in these treatment facilities if you're not providing a quality interpreter.
Unfortunately, programs often have their hands tied. They're locked into a state contract with one particular agency, and they couldn't shop around for someone else more qualified if they wanted to. They can't use the local folks who know the area, who are familiar with the street names downtown, and they have the context. Instead, they're bringing in someone from out of state who has to interrupt over and over again for clarification. So when a facility is locked in, that agency is going to send whoever they have, and unfortunately, that person is not always the most qualified. They're going to send you whatever they've got.
A tip I can offer to service providers is after you've interacted with an interpreter and your client or your patient, you can always ask the deaf person, how did it go? Do you think they were qualified? Were they skilled? Do you want us to list that interpreter as your preferred interpreter? The deaf person has the right also to ask you to list that person as someone that they don't want in their meetings anymore. Please communicate that with the agency to ensure that the deaf person's preferences are noted so that the agency doesn't send that interpreter back. It may be triggering for the deaf person to see that interpreter in the environment again. So again, please provide feedback to the agency based on whether or not the deaf person felt that this interpreter was a good fit or not for the environment. They should be receptive to this feedback, and please feel free to always offer your feedback to the agency.
If a deaf person works well with an interpreter, they'll try to retain them ongoing for consistency's sake. That's the professional who knows their story, their background, the experiences they've had, and can more eloquently interpret for them. They become a team. They develop familiarity with each other. There's less need for interruption and less confusion. It's difficult because the need for an interpreter in a treatment facility is immediate. You at best have 2 or 3 days' notice that there's a need for one. Most agencies prefer a request to be submitted 2 or 3 weeks in advance. It's just not realistic for health-related events. You are scrambling for an interpreter last minute.
Exactly, and having a consistent interpreter can be key for these instances so that they understand what is being talked about in this shared space. They understand background information. Maybe they know who Mary is. They know exactly who M on the chest is. They don't have to ask for clarification or for the full spelling of the name. They've become familiar with the staff and other patients potentially in this facility, making it easier.
Right, that relationship over time builds trust. Suddenly, they're not so worried that what they're going to be saying is misinterpreted or misrepresented. Hearing patients don't have this issue. They might be misunderstood by their peers now and then, but it's because they mumble, right? A consistent interpreter makes a deaf patient feel more at ease, and they have less barriers to their care.
A qualified interpreter will hopefully be at all of the meetings ongoing. But if there is an instance where there's a substitute interpreter, do your best to fill them in advance and definitely let the deaf person know that there is going to be a sub that day.
Right, if there's an established relationship and a couple weeks advance notice, then it's more likely you'll get that person.
We can go on to the next slide here. We'll briefly explain the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990 and how it relates to our work. Title I is related to employment services, and Title II is related to state and local government services. Not providing an interpreter is a violation of the Americans with Disabilities Act, and if you'd like more information on the details of the Americans with Disabilities Act, you can look it up online. It's publicly available. We were discussing earlier about how to locate an interpreter or how to contact an interpreter. One other way, instead of going through an agency, is to look at RID.org. That is the Registry of Interpreters for the Deaf, and it has all certified interpreters listed there with their contact information. It may not have their price or their hourly rate listed, but that is the credentialing body for certified interpreters, and you can locate interpreters through that avenue.
Just in the way that other certifications must be maintained, interpreters have to have continuing education units. Really, the point here is it's the right thing to do. The law requires that you must provide adequate communication access for the deaf and hard of hearing. So it's a settled issue. Just do it. Next slide.
Of course, we want to remind everyone that the deaf patient or the person receiving services is not paying for the interpreter. It is the responsibility of the entity, business, or facility to provide adequate ASL interpreting services and other reasonable accommodations. If there's ever an instance where an agency or organization says, "Oh, you need to bring your own interpreter to this meeting," they obviously have not read through the ADA.
You have no idea how often children as young as 8 or 9 are tasked with interpreting for their injured parent in the emergency room. The hospital doesn't want to chase down an interpreter, or there's one on the way, but they're not there yet. But this is a child. They should not be put in that role, and they're not qualified to do that work for their own parent.
It can be traumatizing for these children in an emergency situation, being tasked with interpreting in a medical setting or a legal setting. And like Kevin mentioned, this is not rare. Still in 2023, we are seeing this happen where children are requested to interpret for their parents or guardians. Next, we'll talk about deaf interpreters, certified deaf interpreters or CDIs, or just deaf interpreters, DIs.
Next slide. Like I mentioned previously, hearing interpreters don't learn ASL until later in life, maybe in high school or in a college education program. They're novices, or at best, they're second language users. They miss out on all the nuance, the complex facial grammar. They're not used to interacting with someone who's injured or who signs informally. They haven't yet, or they may never have a holistic grasp of the language. Let's of course acknowledge that interpreters who have deaf parents that will have learned ASL as a first language. It's much more natural, that's one thing. But they need intensive training as well to understand the interpreting process is a whole nother ballgame. There are deaf people who struggle to comprehend a non-native user of ASL. Those missing pieces can be a big problem. There are hearing interpreters that struggle with a deaf person's native language. They didn't grow up using and seeing that language. Their context is so different. And it's in those situations that a deaf interpreter can help bridge the divide. Deaf interpreting is considered a newly emerging profession. Of course, deaf people have been interpreting for each other their entire lives. Since 4 or 5, deaf kids ask their classmates or their parents, "What did he say?" or "What does that mean?" That part of the process is innate to the deaf experience. But a deaf interpreter will have had specialized training as an interpreter. So with their innate skill and competent interpreting methodology, they can become a certified deaf interpreter. Not all deaf interpreters are certified, but they should at least have an understanding of the process.
True, the deaf interpreter has an in-depth knowledge about cultural norms and grammatical features that oftentimes hearing interpreters can miss because they may not be a native user of the language. So in this scenario, the hearing interpreter will interpret to the deaf interpreter and the deaf interpreter to the client and then back down the line.
Stress can have a huge effect as well. A deaf person who just survived a car accident or has an injured arm and can't sign well may be difficult for a hearing interpreter to understand, and they might need the help of a deaf interpreter.
If they have IVs in their arms and they can't bend their elbows, that may be more difficult for the hearing interpreter.
Yeah, we can understand a yes or a no just in how the deaf person moves their nose. Often, CDIs save time. I can usually get an answer right away that might take a hearing interpreter 2 hours to work up to.
It's important to note that deaf interpreters and hearing interpreters work on a team. If there's an instance where someone does not use American Sign Language, but uses a sign language from their country of origin, the use of a CDI and hearing interpreter team would be beneficial to allow the deaf person to communicate all that they need to. It would not be adequate to only use a hearing interpreter in that situation. Additionally, deaf interpreters are trained in the use of protactile when working with deafblind individuals. Hearing interpreters may not be trained in this area, and there are many other benefits of working with a hearing interpreter and a deaf interpreter team.
It's a good idea to use a deaf interpreter in legal settings. In situations where everything hinges on 1 or 2 details, a simple mistake can mess up your whole life. One mistake can alter the course of events. Everything's being recorded in that setting, so clarity is key. and having a deaf interpreter there helps. Not just the legal setting, but medical, mental health, any setting where the deaf person might be hearing voices in their head or having hallucinations. A CDI might be really necessary.
Hearing interpreter could interpret the sentence, "Did you take your medicine already?" as in, "Did you drink your liquid medication?" Whereas the deaf person is waiting for the question, "Did I take my pill medication?" But the interpreter didn't sign that. So the deaf person answers no. And because of this slight difference in the production of the sign for medicine, the whole interaction is confusing and everyone is misunderstood. Additionally, in legal settings, weapon, there is not an ASL sign for the couched term of weapon. The interpreter could sign gun, and the deaf person will say, "Well, no, I didn't have a gun." In the back of their head, they're thinking, "I had a knife, I didn't have a gun, and that's all you asked me." So it doesn't get to the bones of the question that the attorney was asking. The interpreter may have to ask the judge for clarification on what does a weapon mean in this courtroom, because a weapon could be so many different things. And again, it's important to make sure that we have qualified interpreters in these areas who can manage the environment that they're working in.
The whole point of having a CDI in the room is that shared experience. I understand what it is to be deaf. I have the insight that allows for a more equivalent interpretation. We want deaf patients to have the same access to care as their hearing counterparts. If I'm in the room, I can express things in ways easily understood and act as a cultural mediator, if that's appropriate. Even though our goal is true equality, there's always a slight disparity. A CDI will help mitigate that disparity.
Deaf interpreters are also prepared to draw pictures if necessary. If sign language is not the form of communication that the deaf client is able to use, a deaf interpreter can draw images and approach the situation in that form.
Let's move on. So you might be asking yourself, how does it work? As a deaf interpreter myself, about 90% of the time I work in tandem with a hearing interpreter. The hearing interpreter will interpret what is being said to me. Then I will process that message into a form that's best understood by the deaf person. Sometimes it's similar to what the hearing interpreter signed. Sometimes it's radically different. I'm using comparison. I'm encoding cultural information to get those concepts across. When I have a reply from the deaf person, I will again do the same process, signing it to the hearing interpreter, who will then speak it to the hearing person who asked the question. It requires everyone in the room to work as a team and to be really patient with the delay as we work through the process. You can see on the diagram on screen, the message has to go through 2 interpreters before a response is given, and then it has to come back through both interpreters before the hearing provider can get the response. So you may notice there's been a bit of delay in the interpretation of my presentation today. That delay is compounded when you use a deaf interpreter. It happens that everything must be put on hold until I can clearly express a concept. And not everyone is thrilled about that. Medical staff have serious pressures on their time, and it can take a while. But it's worth the price if it means more clarity, more access, less trips to the hospital because the deaf person didn't understand the doctor's orders, right? How frustrating would it be for them to have to come back for the same issue because they misunderstood something last time?
There is a myth out there that we would like to bust. Deaf people are not less smart than hearing people. There is just a variety of language and a register of communication that is used to express yourself when you're a deaf person. Deaf people are smart and have ways of communicating. You just have to be patient and try out those different avenues, including a deaf interpreter in the process and allowing for that time frame to be extended from maybe a typical 1-hour meeting to a 2-hour meeting so that you are not feeling rushed and your client is not feeling rushed to wrap up the meeting before they've said all they want to say.
Maybe some of you remember during the height of the COVID pandemic, Governor Cuomo of New York gave daily press briefings. And every morning he was joined on screen by an interpreter. What you may not know is that that interpreter was a deaf interpreter. Other states have since followed suit and used deaf interpreters who try to communicate more clearly with that diverse spectrum of language we've talked about in the deaf community. This is really one of COVID's few silver linings.
That was wonderful to see. Captions oftentimes are not adequate, and providing a CDI on screen is always a nice benefit. You may be familiar with this device, and we had mentioned it before. The use of video phones in your facility, if allowed by your regulations. These are what they would look like. This is provided by the company Sorensen. There are other companies that provide these types of devices as well. If you request a video phone for your facility, a tech person from the company will come to set the device up and make sure phone calls are able to be received and made. In the old days, this would require a different phone number, but nowadays the phone systems are able to recognize typical phone numbers, and deaf people are able to call directly to a hearing person's phone line, and hearing people are able to call right back to this specific phone number that will automatically connect with an interpreter on screen so that the deaf person can communicate in sign language, and the hearing interpreter will then voice everything that is signed. So the phone call can happen just like a normal phone call, speaking back and forth with your client, and this is a federally funded program by the FCC, the Federal Communications Commissions, collect tax dollars in order to fund this program so that it is free for deaf people to make phone calls. You may be able to call out to different countries depending on the access level of your video phone in your facility. Oftentimes, deaf people will call out to hearing folks who are not expecting an interpreted phone call, and the hearing person will hang up. So please be mindful if you are receiving this type of phone call and you hear, "This is an interpreted message."
It is so frustrating to get hung up on, especially if you've just waited for 2 hours on hold and someone finally answers only to immediately hang up. The world will get there. It's important that each of your facilities has a video phone available. If you don't have a dedicated monitor and webcam, you can use an iPad or another device with a camera. Patients often have these themselves, but may be required to surrender their cell phone in a treatment center, which means they can't FaceTime with their support network. They can't use a relay service to book their own medical appointments. So it's important that they have access to some type of video phone so they can communicate with the wider world.
Typically, these video relay service companies do not provide these for free for hearing folks. They provide video phones for deaf people. But if your facility can prove that you have a copious amount of deaf patients housed within, you may be able to apply and have a designated video phone set up in your facility. We spoke about VRS, that's Video Relay Service, and one of the regulations on the video relay service is you cannot be in the same location as the person that you are trying to communicate with over the phone. That's where VRI comes into place. Video remote interpreting allows for both people who are trying to communicate to be in the same room. And again, you cannot use VRS for this situation. You have to use VRI. It's funded by the business. But again, there will be an interpreter on the screen for your conversation. You will have to pay per minute for this service. You may find that similar companies that offer VRS services also offer VRI services. Be mindful that there are pros and cons when it comes to using VRI. The interpreter is not able to see the environment that you're in and does not have background information, which may lead to misunderstandings. Your internet speed may not be able to clearly show the video and may cause the interpreter to freeze. Again, this is to be used in short, urgent situations. Keeping these conversations under 5 minutes is recommended. If there is a longer conversation than that needs to happen, it's better to call an in-person interpreter rather than to use VRI services.
An interpreter on an iPad is not going to be accessible to a deafblind person. A tactile-based communication system requires an in-person interpreter. Interpreters who provide VRI services do so over the internet. They're almost always far away. They may not be familiar with the regional signs that are used, which can be stressful. And body position doesn't always work with an iPad on a stand. If the person is supine or prone, it doesn't work well. So VRI should be used as a last resource. It can help bridge the gap until an interpreter can be available in person.
Exactly. VRI can be used in lieu of an in-person interpreter. It's better than no interpreter, but please be mindful that there are pitfalls. Again, it's not a 3D representation of ASL, which is a 3D language.
Next slide. A few additional things to consider. Should you need an interpreter, you may not have advance notice that one will be needed. Even if you know a patient is deaf, you might not know their communication needs or preferences until they arrive on site. Some deaf people prefer CART or computer-aided real-time captioning systems than an interpreter. Once you have a relationship with a patient, then you become familiar with their needs. But again, don't make the assumption until you've had a chance to ask their preference. If you're contracted with an interpreting service that you know does not provide quality interpreters, you may need to find a way to break out of that agreement or fight to have another agency added to the contract. Some of those contracts are legally binding, but the last thing you want to do is stick a deaf person with someone who is unqualified to represent them.
That just adds so much.
So consider how to access a different interpreting agency should you need to, for whatever reason. Don't feel stuck with those contracts because it is the deaf patient who suffers. An agency will have specific policies for each part of a deaf person's recovery process. On the next slide, I will let you take a second to read this anecdote.
Many times businesses are seeking volunteers or asking for people to step up and volunteer to interpret, and that's just not correct.
Have to make a living and they have to put food on their table like the rest of us. Some of their services are provided pro bono. There are settings where the ADA doesn't apply. Weddings, for example, are not covered under the ADA, so either one of the families will fundraise for an interpreter, or that interpreter may offer to work pro bono. At a large family gathering, like Thanksgiving, having an interpreter means that I can catch up with my aunts and my uncles, right? Often interpreters volunteer their time for that kind of work, or they negotiate a reduced rate. So again, when you ask a deaf person to source an interpreter themselves, you're asking them to accept less. In this story, Draco has basically stopped asking and just given up.
Those businesses and organizations who tend to host community events and are not providing interpreters are potentially in violation of the ADA. We want to emphasize this point again. Do not ask children under the age of 18 to interpret. It's not appropriate to have friends or family interpret in these situations. There could be conflicts of interest. They may not have the appropriate training, and they may not be certified. Even if that family member is a certified interpreter, it's best practice to find a neutral party, because it's easier to set boundaries with a neutral party interpreter than your own family member.
Regardless of age, let this person be with their family. Don't task them with communication access while they're worried about their loved one. There's a video that I've seen a few times. Maybe you've seen it as well, Susan. I suspect it's true to life. There's a little girl who's interpreting for her parents at the police station. The parents are picking a criminal out of a lineup, someone who's suspected for the murder of the girl's brother. Can you imagine how heart-wrenching? There's no place for it. There's no need to do that. And I want that to be understood as universal malpractice. Please do not ask family and friends to interpret.
Often law enforcement will ask children or force children to interpret for their family members. There was a situation that happened 3 years ago, and it was spread worldwide on the news across YouTube and social media. There was an 11-year-old child who was forced to interpret after her mother was arrested. The family ended up filing a lawsuit because she was forced to. And you can see in the video, she's crying. She does not want to be the interpreter in this situation while her mother is handcuffed. The Las Vegas police traumatized this child, and it's obvious that they had no training in how to interact with a deaf person in the appropriate manner. Unfortunately, this still happens to this day. Again, no one under the age of 18 should be providing interpreting for anyone in their family, period. They may leave out information, add erroneous information, and communication can break down in this situation.
Maybe you've seen the movie Coda, came out a few years ago. There's a few scenes that are played for laughs where a hearing child is interpreting for the parent's doctor's appointment. I won't spoil it for you, but it is true to life, unfortunately. Next slide.
Always ask. the best thing to do is ask what accommodations and what preferences the deaf person has, whether that be ASL, a written form of communication, or if they only prefer female interpreters versus male interpreters based on traumatizing experiences that they've had, they may have a preference of the gender of the interpreter. They may prefer no interpreter at all. Providing them access to language and communication is key. Language is powerful. Remember how you use language. If you ask, do we need an interpreter rather than do you need an interpreter, that includes the deaf person in the decision-making process. The interpreter is for everyone, not just for the deaf person. This ask burdens the deaf person more rather than just asking, do we need an interpreter because I also do not use your language.
You're right, Susan. Consider who you're addressing when you say you to the deaf person, right? You're the person in the interaction who doesn't know sign language. You both need an interpreter.
Language can influence stigma that is felt and influences moments of feeling empowered or feeling included. Language can bring people in.
Yeah, I remember when I moved to Rochester 7 years ago, I was so surprised that people were asking me if I needed an interpreter. Before coming here, I had to advocate for that for myself. I always said, hey, I need an interpreter, please request one. So to hear that question come from providers was a great feeling.
And remember, if you are providing services to people in rural areas, there may not be interpreters available. The interpreter may have to drive a couple of hours to reach your facility. The prices may also increase based on the travel time for the interpreter to that area. So you will have to be considerate of that.
It's important to keep in mind all of those expenses can actually be written off your taxes. So consider that.
Those are all write-offs that you can list on your tax returns. The next bullet point, it's so important to keep making mistakes, keep trying. Make sure that the changes you are making to your facility to provide access and equity to the community are seen. The more you try, the better visible your services will become. It will be known that you value deaf people and you believe that they deserve adequate care.
Next slide. SAISD is here to provide best practice advice to anyone and do anything that we can do to help make your facilities more accessible and improve the way that you work with deaf and hard of hearing people. We can provide advice about how to work better for interpreters. We're happy to come to you with in-service workshops. We're also available by phone or by email. We do this work because we believe that deaf people are worth the effort. Some of the things we can offer help the deaf community, but they also better your facilities. We do this completely free of charge, so please feel free to get in contact with us.
Absolutely. Do you think we should wrap up with talking about Deaf Standard Time? DST?
Sure.
So for those of you who don't know, Deaf Standard Time is what we refer to as DST. And it would come about when, let's say we're at a birthday party that the invitation says it starts at 1 o'clock. All the hearing people would arrive at 1 o'clock. The deaf invitees would arrive around 2 o'clock. And maybe the invitation says 1 to 4. So the party is expected to end at 4. All of the hearing children leave around 4 o'clock with their parents right on time. There they go, right out the door. The deaf group, the deaf parents, the deaf children, are there chatting until probably midnight, until you have to kick them out of your house, maybe. That's DST. We tend to stay and chat and share our experiences long into the night, catch up with each other, no matter what time the facility closes. If a restaurant closes at 9, the waiters and staff will have to usher us out the door at probably 9:30. That's a fun piece of deaf culture that we get to be a part of in the deaf community. If you're curious at all and want more information, we can always provide presentations, as Kevin had mentioned. Feel free to reach out to us. If you have questions about your facility and how to make that better accessible for folks, or if you're wondering where to refer deaf people to, and you want to make sure those facilities are ready with interpreting services set up and other accommodations, we can be a partner in assisting you to help remove those barriers for your deaf clients and deaf patients. We can call ahead to be sure that the place that you are referring them to is accessible.
It's a good idea to keep in touch with the deaf person after you've made that referral. Check in on them some point after they've left your facility. All too often, our work stops after someone is referred elsewhere. And that may work for hearing people with plenty of support, but checking in on a deaf patient after they've left your facilities can help ease the transition for them, wherever they end up afterwards. You're in a position to help advocate for an interpreter and to be an ally for this person on their recovery journey. So please don't just check the box and let them slip through the cracks. They need your attention and your care, and you can help support that.
It's always better to have a warm handoff than a cold handoff, and cut the tie.
I like that, warm handoff, definitely.
Lastly, we just want everyone to keep in mind what it means to be an ally to the deaf community. It means buying deaf-related content from deaf artists or creators, not hearing folks who have co-opted the sign for I love you in sign language and are trying to profit off of it. That's cultural appropriation. And if you are interested in buying merchandise with ASL logos or other images of ASL signs on it, please be sure that you are investing in the deaf ecosystem. When you're looking for these products, make sure that it's a deaf creator, a deaf artist, a deaf graphic designer. Follow deaf creators on social media. There are plenty of hearing people trying to teach ASL online or other sign languages, and oftentimes their production is incorrect. They're not teaching the correct signs. So please ignore those hearing teachers of ASL and do look for deaf creators on social media. Deaf content creators and deaf teachers of ASL would be the best places if you're trying to learn more information about ASL. Additionally, we've included some resources for you, and we can be your resource. Please feel free to reach out to us anytime.
Thank you for your attention today, and please, again, do reach out if you have any questions or need any more information. You may not have come across deaf people that often, but if you do, just know you can reach out to your friends at SAISD. We are ready and waiting.
We've also included here a list of publications regarding substance use disorder, language deprivation, and other interesting topics that we feel may be helpful to you in your work.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Once again, thank you for joining us, and keep up the good work.